I'd like to share just a little bit about who we are and what we do within the Leadership Collective to support you in your role as leaders. At the Leadership Collective, our mission is to empower leaders with insights and resources and provide an environment for you to connect and work with other leaders to help you excel within your role and help you accelerate your career. We're here to be your trusted community with two key objectives: to support you in realizing your goals individually as leaders, but also to help you perform within your existing organization and maximize your potential within the role that you're in currently. Our community is completely free to join. It's a space where you can connect with peers, share knowledge, and access expert content in lots of different forms. So we have a peer-to-peer setup so you can join our Slack channel, our WhatsApp channel. The second thing we do outside of the peer-to-peer collaboration is curated content. So we do lots of different forms of content, from podcasts to live events like this, face-to-face events as well. We also have advisory services where you can receive personalized guidance to solve complex issues or challenges tailored to your organization's needs. So, for example, we help organizations set up or enhance your existing GCC or Global Capability Center, which we're going to learn about today. Let me start with an introduction to Jennie Mead. So after many years in leading HR, people and culture across multiple organizations, Jennie is an executive coach, board advisor and fractional chief people officer with a very distinguished career in leadership and organizational development. Jennie will be leading the discussion today with our experts. I'd also like to introduce you. I've mentioned earlier Arvind Chaturvedi, who's a board advisor, a former managing director, and a seasoned technology leader with over 30 years of experience driving business transformation, product modernization, and building high-performance global teams for many large corporations. And I would also like you to introduce you to Ben Cansfield, who is a partner at EY, helping Fortune 500s and other startup businesses address the complexities of engaging an international workforce. Ben leads EY's EMEA team, specializing in people-focused international hiring models and tailored talent solutions. You can view all the profiles on our experts today on LinkedIn. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Jennie.
Thanks ever so much, Chris. So I'm delighted to be here. Before we delve into the main points of today's session, it's perhaps worth looking at what exactly is a GCC. It's not actually a term that I've used, practically speaking, but it may sound obvious in terms of a global capability centre, but there's also other terms that it can be referred to. So in short, a global capability centre is what a multinational corporation uses in terms of operating offshore or nearshore to provide services or capabilities to a parent organisation. So GCCs are sometimes referred to as captive centres, global in-house centres. I've referred to them in my career as global technology centres, global innovation centres, and they can provide a wide variety of capabilities, IT, research development, engineering, business process management, finance, HR, analytics, business intelligence, and I've certainly been involved in machine learning and AI in more recent years with those. So I want to take a look at how many of you are using GCCs, and this is so that Ben, Arvind and I can actually sort of tailor the conversation we're having today. So we're bringing up our first poll, which has just come up. Thank you very much to the secret fairies behind us, bringing that all up. Can you tell us which are you? Do you already operate a GCC? Are you currently exploring or planning a GCC, outsourcing it already to third parties, perhaps relying on much more of a regional team structure, or do you not have a current global strategy? So we'll give you a few seconds, as I can see you're all busily interacting, which is great, and we'll try and get the clip to close the poll in a few more seconds. So very good. Look at you. That's brilliant. 70% of you, 72%. We're doing really well. Sometimes I sit on webinars and see this going up painfully slowly. So it's very good to see so much engagement. Okay, so we'll end the poll now, and that will give us a bit of an idea that actually, obviously, 33% of you are already operating in GCCs. Be very keen to get your questions on how they're doing. 17% of you are exploring, which is good, actually. So we'll be able to definitely tailor the The content today, if you are in the exploring, outsourcing to third parties, 11% of you. Relying on regional teams, also 11%. So that's quite interesting, because at some point you may think about pivoting. And this, again, will help you with today's discussion. And 28% no global strategy, which again is fine. And hopefully will give you some food for thought as we run through today. So thanks very much for doing that. We'll move on. So in terms of strategic advantages when you're contemplating the use of a global capability centre, certainly from my own perspective, in the many years I've been looking at this, it has changed over time. And if I go back 15 years, cost efficiency was probably one of the more common reasons in terms of why organisations were looking at, let's look at a global capability centre, or the term that was used at the time. But I would argue that organisations that set up GCCs purely on cost savings, particularly as they have evolved over the last 10 years at least, you're missing out on the broader value that comes with a well-structured GCC and how that can deliver benefit into an organisation. Then this is something that EY will no doubt be probing clients on when they're looking to invest in GCC. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I mean, completely agree. I think there obviously are the cost benefits, right, to a GCC and other similar models, but kind of in our experience, when that's been maybe the sole driver, or really focused on too much, that's where we see a lot of these models kind of fail quite early doors. And where we see them work really well is where there's an appreciation really early days that kind of at the heart of this are people, right? You may be changing roles, moving people, hiring people in new markets, etc., etc. And with that, there's people become unsettled. There's cultural differences. There's kind of emotions. These are people, right? So if you just purely manage the business from a spreadsheet and just look at the costs, so what's cost today versus what cost could be, in our experience, that's likely to fail. But if you really put people at the center of this and kind of ensure that it's part of the planning, implementation, operation, that's where we see you have the highest percentage chance of models like this being a success.
Yeah, and just to build on what Ben said, hello everyone. So really, I mean, if nothing else, from a GCC, you ought to be looking at the operational benefits that it can create for you, and there are lots and lots of those, quite frankly. I mean, you got to get greater control on operations for sure, because you literally have your operations sitting under one roof, which is great. GCCs by their very nature are such that they're multifunctional, units. So you get great cross-functional advantages. You have synergies that you can draw by running processes effectively and optimize them across functions. It's quite amazing, actually. And then obviously there is the whole alignment that GCCs have with the corporate strategy and the objectives, which is by their very nature, because they're part of the organization that they belong to. Unlike an outsourced partner, for that matter. That's what I'm comparing it with. So to your point, Jenny, quite frankly, I mean, choosing to set up a GCC should be a well thought through decision, quite frankly, with the broader objectives in mind and the value that you're trying to create overall. And if you've not got that sorted, we saw in our poll that a number of people are still running with outsourcing through to third parties, and that's quite all right, because those models exist. And they actually coexist with the GCCs. So, you can have a GCC and that doesn't preclude you from actually outsourcing to a third party. And that can be done, in various ways. I mean, the models that have existed over time, staff augmentation, SOW project-based, or managed services, teams, nearshore, offshore, onshore even, or typically these are all mixed, and deployed as a mix of models, if you like, which is multi-shore, multi-sourcing kind of model. If you think that's working for you, that's quite all right as well, because they still work. And like I said, they work alongside GCCs as brilliantly as they did on their own earlier, before the GCCs became popular, quite frankly. So, but when you set out to do a GCC, to your point where you started, think it through. Back to you, Jenny.
And I think it's a really good clarity to bring, because I think it needs to be thought through right at the highest levels. If I go back to some functions that might look at it in terms of actually why a function may want to drive that, it has to be really delivered at the strategic level, you've got a board, you're having conversations with the board, with the senior leadership team, global leadership team, whatever that term is. Because if you're not assessing what the benefit realization is likely to deliver with a global capability center, to your points, you're unlikely to measure success within that. And certainly when it comes to cost pressures, that is often when it's a very reactive decision-making process. And so, and Ben, to your point, the people side of it's really important, because often or not, what I see and hear, even now, is that when companies want to set up a GCC, the clarity isn't fully there as to the why they're doing it. And then there is that question on the when they're going to do it as well, rather than the reactive approach. And so I would be suggesting, ask yourself this, or ask your board members, or ask your senior leadership team members this, if you're not in that position to have, to be in, as part of those conversations. What is the purpose? What are the benefits going to bring to the organization? And then you should be asking, how are you going to engage talent with the GCC in terms of the purpose that that's going to bring, in terms of how are you going to provide that story to them? Because if it's to provide a cost-efficient service, then it's unlikely those people are going to engage in that. And I think that that's a really, really important point I've picked up just from hearing both of you speaking now. And Arvind, I know you've seen this firsthand in terms of helping and guiding companies on this. So taking through to purpose, what would your thoughts be on that?
You're absolutely right. Completely agree that the purpose has to be clear. More so, to Ben's point and your point, to be able to communicate that to the people you're going to hire, to get them behind you to actually deliver that value, quite frankly. And driving down cost is not a great reason to give to people when you hire them, for sure. Absolutely, like you said, Jennie. And I think, the GCCs really come into play. When do they come into play, in my view? They come into play when you're trying to change the direction of the business that you're in, really. And it could be in any shape or form. It could be for the momentum of the business changing, or the scale changing, size changing, direction changing, adding a new line of business, whatever you're trying to do, quite frankly. So when you're thinking of such strategic changes to your business, that's when typically GCC comes into being. The cost efficiency or the cost advantage is a given, because you're going to a low-cost location in any case, and you're going to derive that out of just being there, quite frankly. But what else are you going to get out of it? If I just look at the three GCCs that I have led in my life to date, if I go back to the 2010, 2011, 2014 period, Capita Business and Capita IT Services, which was part of the Capita Group PLC. We set up the GCC with a very simple objective. We wanted to really standardize, streamline our services that we provided to our many, many customers in the UK. Yeah, and really, GCC gave us that option to build those great multi-tenant services from under one roof. And that was great, because we really, brought that experience to the next level altogether. So customer experience became, quite frankly, the benefit we were trying to drive out of that GCC. Go a few years on, look at AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company. We set it up for a completely different reason. AstraZeneca traditionally had outsourced the IT completely, and in doing so, had sort of lost control on the IT, to be honest. And then the transformation program came along, and the decision was to bring it all back in. Why? Because the business, frankly, were indifferent to IT at that point. They couldn't care less, because IT wasn't doing much for them. The idea was to win the trust back of the business and really become their partners, make technology a partner of science to actually innovate and grow the business. And for that, it was very important to have those services insourced, and AstraZeneca was all about that. Again, in the end, it was the business's experience and ability to grow the business. That was the real benefit we were trying to drive out of it. Insourcing was the means to the end, to be honest. And if you take my most recent stint with CDK Global, it is a product company, an automotive retail software product company. The idea was to have a center of product development and technology, which could actually reduce the time to market for the product, put more product out there in the market in a shorter space of time, essentially pick up the quality and make it, a really high quality product. All of those were the driving factors there. And of course, our solution was the product and alongside all the services that ran, surrounding a product essentially. And that was part of our solution. And it was also our objective to make sure those services were really honed and sharpened for the customer's benefit. So again, customer experience, product quality, all of that became the objective. So I think, and did they derive the cost advantage? Of course they did. I mean, that was a given in any case. But having that higher objective meant, to your point, Jennie, and Ben's point from earlier, the engagement with the people we hired was that much better. Everybody was on a mission. That mission was aligned with the corporate strategy, and they knew that they were creating value already. They were doing meaningful work, and that's very, very important, according to me. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all those points. I think traditionally cost has been a big focus, but the pattern that we're seeing now I'll keep bringing it back to the people element, because the people element is so powerful, right? And that's, I think, to your point, yes, you can set these up in a countries, and just by being there, it can be cost efficient on a piece of paper. But if you don't get it right, the additional cost, time and effort you have to put into it, it will far outweigh that, like I said, that balance sheet cost that a lot of organizations approach it with. And you mentioned kind of these models being used with other models, kind of spot on, seeing exactly that as well. And that's where we're seeing kind of organizations really try and flex how they employ people and where they employ people. And we've seen that definitely accelerated since COVID. So, I mean, it's taken 23 minutes for someone to mention COVID. So I'm playing buzzword bingo out there. That's probably one of them. But it's true. We've definitely seen a push since COVID for organizations looking to bring roles to the employee rather than the traditional method of bringing the employee to the role. So as I'm sure you're all seeing day to day, it's an incredibly fierce market out there when you're trying to hire new talent. So organizations looking to go into new talent pools, with that brings complexities, but they're also looking at, well, if we're going to do this from a talent strategy agenda perspective, can we align this potentially with a GCC? So, for example, with a global employment company, and seeing more and more ways of these traditional models being used together to kind of cater for different parts of the business. And we could probably do a whole session on global employment companies, but I think the main point there is, when looking at a GCC or what other models are out there, you shouldn't and you don't need to just look at them in isolation. You can have hybrid models that really work for the broader business.
And I remember, Ben, talking to you about that when I was at Cloud Factory back in 2020, actually, in terms of what was our strategy. So that's brought back very fond memories of our conversations over lockdown. So we've explored the strategic advantages, and certainly things like everything that's been mentioned. I've also talked in my role about, actually, do you chase the sun in terms of how you think about that customer experience and how you get your strategy? And certainly some of the things that have been mentioned in terms of how you can run GCCs alongside other alternatives will help you think about that. But for me, a big question that you also have to think about and actually really press the senior leadership team on is the when you should do it, not just the why you should do it, but the when you should do it. Because I mentioned earlier on about this reactive view, and actually thinking about it proactively will make sure that when you think from a strategic perspective, you're more likely to think about it proactively. But for me, the when isn't just about a question of logistics, but something that's more closely tied to broader business objectives and what the strategic priorities are and when those priorities need to be delivered. And from my experience, implementing a GCC too early or without the right leadership foundation, and that's a really key word there, the leadership foundation in place, even the systems and processes, for example, if the organization's maturity isn't ready to manage this, then it will backfire. And managing those cross-border complexities are going to be difficult. And I've seen that in organizations where GCCs have actually become a liability rather than an asset. Arvind, you're nodding on this. I want to hear your views on this.
No, absolutely. I'm nodding because I completely agree with the point that you can really get this wrong if you don't get the timing right. And the timing is all about, when are you ready to make a big change as an organization? Because GCC is not for the faint-hearted at all, to be honest. It's an endeavor that actually starts from the transformation of the enterprise that it represents, quite frankly. In terms of people's roles, people's responsibilities, the workflows that exist across the organization, etc. And that's a huge change. That is probably the most critical part of the GCC setup program, according to me, the transformation of the parent enterprise. And unless you're willing to actually commit the time and resource that you require to do that, really you're probably going to get it right, like you said, Jenny, because it's not going to come out right. I know the timing of a GCC is usually driven by a business imperative, something that's come up, something big that's come up in terms of strategic business decision or an external market factor that's come into play. You got to address that, and GCC could be a response to that, and understand that. But the moment you think GCC, you've got to be thinking about the time and resource that you have to commit to make that endeavor successful. And are you as an organization willing to do that? And if you're not, at that point in time, maybe you need to look at alternate models. You need to look at alternatives that exist out there. And we've spoken about a few of them. I'm not going to repeat those, but really it is about thinking through the why that we talked about. What's the purpose? Why are we doing this? And is our timing right? Are we ready for it as an organization? That's very, very important. Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, the pushing a button on this at the right time is absolutely crucial. In terms of what does the market look like, how's the business performing, does it need to scale up, cut costs, new talent, etc. So getting the timing right is crucial, but also I think Jenny alluded to it, that foundation is having the right people involved at the right time. And from our experience, that right time is right at the start, because where we've seen these not go particularly well or be delayed or derailed, etc., is when, take an example, that it could be a tax and finance led initiative, and then right at the end of the project, there's a realization that, we need to employ people in this model. Let's bring HR in. And then it's just human nature, right? If you're brought into a project late, you're going to try and find reasons as to what's wrong with it, what have they missed, to try and justify why you should have been brought in earlier. Not purposely to disrupt it, but just to get the point across of we should have been involved in this from the start. So I think the when's definitely important, but before you push the button on it, you need to make sure you've got the right stakeholders and business units aligned, because it can cater for many different business issues. And that's where we see the best chance of success, is when the business is really aligned across the different units. It doesn't necessarily all have to agree 100%, but you're all on the same page, and the direction of what the model can, and also more importantly, sometimes what it can't and what it doesn't deliver.
And Ben, actually, you just reminded me, I have a client who recently actually complained because HR was driving the initiative and forgot to get tax involved. So it just shows you, doesn't it, actually how that point is really, really important right at the start. Yeah,
it's not uncommon. You normally get those kind of battles, should we say, internally, especially when you're looking at moving people or operations internationally, because some of their risk thresholds are slightly different from a tax and a people perspective, maybe. So yeah, kind of definitely align the business units early, I would say.
Yeah. So we shouldn't underestimate the complexities, and actually getting support to be able to do that is really helpful when you set up the GCC. Let's move to our second poll now. So what we're keen to know is whether or not you're in the middle of setting one up, whether you've already got one set up. Can you tell us what you see the biggest challenges in establishing a GCC? So the poll is up. We're interested to see what you've got to say. Thank you again all for jumping in so quickly. It's quite evenly split at the moment. Okay, over 60% of you participated. Any more? Thank you very much. So I will close that off now with 62%. Thanks ever so much. That's actually that's a bit more evenly split than I thought. Arvind, Ben, what are your thoughts on this? Because there's no, apart from cultural differences and securing executive buy-in, not far off.
I do like the cultural differences one, because that is a key point. And we can come on to locations later, but that's definitely a point organisations are looking at now, because where we've seen some of these models fail, where we've been brought in to look at what's going wrong, is that a culture has been derived of us and them almost, and that's when these models can just not work and can become a bit toxic. So getting the understanding, I'd say, at the start, the cultural differences and appreciating them is crucial, but then working with them, that's the next big step. So yeah, I like that one coming out.
Yeah, and I equally, I was going to hone in on the securing executive buy-in because, clearly these responses have come from people who've actually done the job. They've been there. They've done GCCs essentially, and they are not surprised that those two figured as the top reason for people, and the others are, like you said earlier, it's very evenly distributed. So yeah, it's a very knowledgeable audience we got out here.
That's great, and actually it's good because it will move us nicely on to our next section now. So in terms of from my perspective, and the bit bearing in mind my background as a CPO or CHRO, the biggest challenge I've seen is the talent strategy piece. So it's quite natural for organizations when you start to think about a GCC is to think about just naturally talent attraction and getting roles defined in the first place. That immediate, what are the next steps? But if I would start to consider the key success factors, making sure it's successful means, in my experience, actually thinking of the end point, thinking about the longer term and what I call the Horizon 2 and the Horizon 3 planning. Don't just start with the talent attraction. This has to be done in terms of making decisions around talent strategy. And if companies aren't thinking strategically about that, you will miss the wider talent management approach. And you might end up, you will probably end up with retention issues with talent and putting in a lot more effort where, in terms of keeping that going, where you needn't have to, if you thought about it from a talent strategy perspective. Don't just jump into the Horizon 1. Don't be reactive to it and spend time thinking about that. And also putting together that playbook of how you're going to deliver it, that playbook of thinking about the whole cultural piece and the local culture and all that good stuff that Ben just mentioned a moment ago, but also how you're going to get the most out of collaboration, innovation and growth. It's not that easy to do. And we're all struggling at the moment in terms of the hybrid way of working. You factor that in with multiple cultures as well, it becomes much more tricky. Ben, you were mentioning about the cultural alignment. So tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on why that has to be really thought through.
I think, to my point earlier around it can become toxic if culture isn't appreciated and kind of baked into the implementation and the go forward operation of the model. Too many times, like I say, we've seen it at an us and them culture. So culture is definitely important, but I think also when implementing these, it's the impact on the current workforce, which we see a lot of the time almost be forgotten because it will be incredibly unsettling. More times than not, there could be redundancies with this, but that doesn't mean you want to or you're going to lose all roles. I think it's key to have really clear communication around this. This isn't a complete offshoring model. It's just some roles will change. It may free time up to be more strategic. Roles are going to evolve, for example. So there's lots of different angles to think about when you're thinking about culture, not just the culture of where is your business now and what is the culture of this new jurisdiction you're going to add in. You want to foster that culture that you have within the business to bring these new regions and business units into the group. And there's numerous ways you can do that. I think it's probably unique to each organisation in terms of what their culture is and how they want to go about doing that. I think it's the key point is don't lose sight of that and make sure that whatever model you land on, it's not cut out from the core organisation, if you like. It's seen as one.
Yeah, I think that integration piece is absolutely important. And we've all spoken about it, but frankly, if we miss that one thing, then frankly, it's never going to get become a unit of the organization. They will function as one unit at all. And to Ben's point and your point, but I think really, if you and Ben said this, right? There'll be changes in roles. Some of the roles will go away from the existing enterprise. All of those things have to be thought through, as I was mentioning earlier as well. Once you get that right, then coming back to Ben's point about how well do you integrate, and your point, Jennie, that you made about integrating the whole workflow, essentially, that has to be your next big question that you're trying to address as to how do the workflows flow across these various regions that you got people are in, and how do they work to that, essentially. That has to be thought through. And then you got to think about what technologies are you going to leverage. for making them seamless, the workflow seamless, the collaboration seamless, the collaboration piece that Ben touched upon. The technology is so important for this, and unless you thought that through, you could actually lose a big advantage that the GCC can give you, which is really, adopting more automation, more technology to do things that much more efficiently and effectively, quite frankly. I mean, GCCs have been known to be at the forefront of the digitization and digitalization, whatever word you prefer using, of organizations, quite frankly. And technology, adoption of technology driving up that within the organization and moving the organization forward in terms of its transformation journey is what GCCs have done. And it's a great opportunity. But if you don't do that, then that's probably the biggest error you made in setting up a GCC and thereby not leveraging all the value it can create for you. The other thing that I completely focused on every time I talk about this, Jennie and Ben, is that and I mentioned this briefly earlier. Don't think about building all the capability within the organization that you need, because there's an ecosystem around you. And these are competing ecosystems, competing parties in an ecosystem which actually can be used to your benefit. There are startups there are other service providers there. They're there to actually provide us with those specialized skills and talent that we need, which you don't have to build under our roof if we don't need it on a long-term basis. So think about how your GCC can orchestrate the ecosystem to its benefit as well, because these, quite frankly, the modern GCCs are becoming an orchestration engine of the entire ecosystem. And unless you set them up for that, that could be a bad miss as well, to be honest. So, obviously all the operational nuts and bolts have to be taken care of, the compliance aspect, the data privacy aspect, you're talking of security, both physical, digital, how are you placed against the policy framework of the larger organization? All of those are very, very important. Those are operational necessities, as I call them, the nuts and bolts. Those have to be taken care of. But really addressing talent the way, Jennie, you talked about it and Ben talked about it, addressing roles, responsibilities, workflows, technology, use of technology, and using the ecosystem effectively. All of these really become the contributing factors to making a GCC successful.
And Arvind, you just started to hint on some of the pitfalls that organizations often fall into. And let's have a look at those, because I think it's always good to go in with eyes wide open. And actually, the poll earlier, I was really, it was good to see that there was already a recognition for what I think is one of the biggest pitfalls, and that is the lack of executive sponsorship. And let me tell you what I mean by a lack of executive sponsorship. It's not just about signing off budgets and approving the GCC establishment. That's not what we mean by executive sponsorship. And often I see that happen. It's about ensuring that the GCC has the visibility, has the necessary resources. And again, don't underestimate what we mean by necessary resources, and alignment with the rest of the business to thrive. So when executives are disengaged, or they see their role just as sponsoring a project, rather than being a lot more involved in it and doing it in the right way, what happens is that GCC suffers from unclear objectives, competing priorities as well with other strategic projects going on, and that lack of integration with the broader organisation that we've already talked about. So you really need to be careful that senior leaders aren't just seen sat in their ivory tower in HQ, that they're integral to cementing that purpose and really telling a story as to what that purpose is and why the GCC is a strategic priority. It's not a tick box exercise. Arvind, I'm sure you've probably seen this as well. What are your thoughts on this?
And we saw that in the poll as well, right? We had 28% against executive leadership buy-in. Absolutely spot on. I think I've seen more transformation programs fail because the executives were not backing it up. Essentially, they had not thought it through, or they probably lost the belief, or they lost the interest in the program, and the program falls apart. It's never down to execution. It's down to the strategic vision sitting behind it, quite frankly. And if that's not clear, and everybody's not bought into it, then everything's starting from what we were talking of earlier, which is the big transformation that needs to happen in the existing enterprise. That itself becomes a formidable undertaking, quite frankly, if you're not careful. So I think the leaders backing the program up is extremely important, to your point, Jennie, and I think they have to be completely bought into that. In fact, the whole clarity of vision and purpose needs to come from them, and has to be driven through the organization so that everybody understands that clearly. And we talked about that briefly earlier, but one of the reasons why you need it so desperately is because through your journey, which is not a short journey at all, this is an endeavor for the long haul. Through the journey, doubts will come up and uncertainties will surface, and you'll start questioning why we did this in the first place. All of those things happen. And all of these things have happened for all the GCCs that I have done in my life as well, essentially. But that's when you go back and look at why we started this all. What was the purpose? Are we still driving towards that? Do we need to tweak that, fine-tune that, and take it further from there? Those questions become more productive and constructive responses to those uncertainties that come about. And back to the talent point, how do you keep the people going, people you've hired, and people who are backing this program up from the larger enterprise? You got to go and sort those questions out for them, because those questions, if they're coming at the leadership level, I can bet my bottom dollar that it's definitely coming at the ground level as well, and people are beginning to question that as time bites by. So really, don't ever think or underestimate the need for the leadership buy-in, leadership backing, and the clarity in terms of the purpose of the vision. The other thing that I have seen sometimes resulting in poor outcomes being delivered by GCCs is the over-indexing on the cost. We talked about it, right? If you over-index on the cost, you're then trying to drive false economies. You're not hiring the right leadership. You're not hiring the right talent. You've automatically made the centers suboptimal in terms of the value that it can deliver. So the cost is there to be aware and will come through. Take it for granted. It may not come through to the ratio that you set out to achieve when you first wrote up the business case, but that's a reality check that you got to make very early on. But the cost advantage will still be there. Don't over-index on it, because you don't want to make the whole center suboptimal. Ben, your insights?
Yeah, and I'll just add a very quick couple of points, because I don't want to take away from the Q&A time. I think the two pitfalls that kind of I see in experience of putting these in place is poor planning. So not being clear on the why are you looking at these models, and then not being overly clear on exactly what are they and what are they not. That can lead to poor implementation and then not an overly successful model. So it's an obvious point, but poor planning has a really big impact on pitfalls. And the last one, be patient. It's you don't set these up on a Monday and you're realizing the benefits on the Friday. It's be patient with it, have fair metrics involved to review how they're working that align with when they should be working. So the point there is be patient. You're not going to realize the benefits overnight, and it's okay to pivot and flex as you go through the model. That doesn't mean failure, but overarching point, good planning, all the stakeholders aligned early doors, and be patient as you go through the journey, because it really is a journey.
I think that's a really good point, Ben, the be patient. And I've seen organizations almost, they want to take the risk on something like this, but they don't give it enough time. And actually it's just a wasted investment if they're not patient enough. I think that's a very valid point. Well, look, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know, and I can see that there are many questions coming through. So I'm going to pass over to Chris to see what those questions are. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you all. That's been great and really insightful. There's a number of questions, to be honest. First question is from Debbie Joseph. Hello, Debbie. Debbie's been involved in our community right from the beginning. Your first one is, does a GCC need to be a separate place or location, or can the corporate headquarters be the GCC itself? And I know that's sort of becoming a growing trend. So maybe Arvind, could you kick us off with your thoughts around that?
There's no reason why the corporate headquarters cannot be the GCC at all. Clearly, then you're not driving for the cost advantage, which is fine, because you're not going to a low-cost location to drive cost arbitrage. And that's okay, because that doesn't have to be a primary objective. Your primary objective might be completely different. It could be operational efficiency. It could be some strategic business change that you're trying to bring about. And building a GCC or a center of excellence or a global innovation center within the corporate headquarters, absolutely the right thing to do if that's where the talent is. Go after the best talent that you can get to actually achieve the outcome that you want to achieve, as opposed to look at whether it's one location or the other, would be my answer.
I know as well, Arvind. I see Vinu Nair is in the chat here, and we did a podcast the other day about this. And I won't go into all of the thoughts now that it's on the podcast. But Vinu was saying a lot about how in the future, had a crystal ball that the future of GCCs may actually be to put the headquarters there more often, and they become the nerve centres. I think was the term he used to actually drive businesses, and that's kind of the direction it's heading in. So
that's an interesting way to look at it, right? The corporate headquarters themselves shifting to the GCC as opposed to the GCC being in the corporate headquarters. So, back to Debbie's question, it could be one or the other taking Vinu's take on it, which I completely agree with, actually. It's quite possible. Yeah. First.
It's a really good point because we've done a number of feasibility studies and kind of the conclusion has been the grass isn't always greener somewhere else. It's where you're currently based. That's delivering exactly what you need from all sorts of aspects. So you don't need to go big bang with a new model. You just maybe need to tweak the current model that you've got and locations you've currently got.
Yeah. Very interesting. Just another question from Debbie. I'm just going to point this one towards you, Jennie, as well. So Jennie's question, just reading it here: cultural differences, salary structures, and benefits. What tools have you been, have people been using that helps to convey the message of fair pay and benefits for all?
Yeah, this is a really good one, actually, because I had to really think about this about 5 years ago, operating across countries like Nepal and Kenya and things like that. Now, the biggest thing I would say is, one, you need to have a really good compensation philosophy that's transparent, that you can share what the design principles around that you have some clarity on that. That would include things also like a methodology that you use now to get salary data for the local market. So the design principle might be, we will pay in line with the role, in line with the local market, etc. Be really clear on that to know that actually it's market driven. Then the question is going to be, well, how do you get details about salaries in the market? Now, if you're an organization that is able to get access to and pay for salary data, then that's great, but it's not always possible, and you may not always be able to find it. I certainly couldn't find it when I was operating in Nepal. Very, very difficult in Kenya. So then it becomes a question of actually how can you then structure and say, this is what my methodology is going to be. If we can't get salary data or a salary survey, how are you then going to get that data? Are you going to use an indexing approach because you can find country to country indexing, or other ways? And that's where you can talk to a compensation and benefit specialist to help try and structure that. So that's what I would say. And Ben, actually, I know that you've obviously had conversations around this from a global mobility perspective. So if you've got anything to add on that.
I agree with that. Organisations can also look at global pay bands, so they don't necessarily care where the role is. This is what we value that role. That obviously has its pros and cons. Benefits is a big one. Try and, at that point I mentioned earlier, that us and them culture, trying to align benefits, equity, share plans. They don't work in all countries for various tax reasons. So if you can't or don't offer them, being really clear on why, but then try and offer something else to bring them up to parity. So I think it's it's not just salary and bonus, it's the whole package you want to try and mirror across the group, including a GCC.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. You can't answer this question in a couple of minutes, and actually it's definitely something to think about and get some thoughts on, and use the leadership collective group to ask on that, because it's a really good question.
Yeah,
I was just about to say.
Sorry, Chris. I agree with Jennie and on that really it is very specific to the location that you're trying to do this in, to be honest, and the constraints of that location and how you can actually get to that information on the salary, and various techniques have been used, and there are organizations like who help you do that as well. But really it's down to getting to that detail and then addressing that, to Jennie's point. So yeah, come back to Leadership Collective for that, Chris.
Both of you very kindly mentioned what I was going to say, actually. I mean, we get more requests for salary and benchmark data for GCCs and recruitment in general, but specifically for GCC locations than any other requests. So, and that includes, recruitment requests themselves. It's like it's the most common thing that we get asked about because of the gap in data that's available. Depending on which part of the world, maybe the data's not up to date. In some countries, I think you alluded to, Jenny, it just simply doesn't exist, or it's not been framed together yet. And actually, I would say, we have a recruitment arm to our business, but I would say, recruitment companies in general can be very useful too, assuming that they've got the knowledge and experience actually in that particular country and region to offer some of those real-time insights, which seem to change every 5 minutes at the moment in some of these countries.
And I would, Ben mentioned feasibility studies when you're thinking about GCCs. That's one of the questions that you need to stick in, just so that you're really clear on which, as a location, when you're doing a feasibility study and you're at the location point of looking, then those sorts of the questions are the ones that you want to go in when you're paying for that feasibility study to be done.
Yeah, like you said, I think we could do a whole new session on this in itself. Genuinely, I think, I'm not just saying that. I think there's so many things to think about there, and how quickly it changes and everything as well, and the differences across benefits, let alone salary and total comp, and how that looks over the coming year or 2 years ahead as well, and how quickly it changes. I just want to squeeze in one last question, but maybe if we can keep the answers brief in the interest of time, because I know we're coming towards the end. But Amy, I know you put a question in the chat. Who would you all recommend having on a project team when setting up a GCC? HR, IT, facilities, tax, etc. Maybe you guys can keep it to just a few words each. Maybe starting with yourself, Jenny.
Yeah, I go back to Ben's point earlier on, actually. At the very, very start, you've got to make sure that you've got all the right stakeholders, and don't think that, just be making sure that people are aware that you're thinking about GCC, and then also deciding from a RACI matrix perspective going forward, are they responsible? Are they accountable? Do they just need to be informed or consulted? Be really, really clear on that. The second thing I've always done is I've always asked for external help. I mentioned earlier on that Ben and I were talking on something I was working on with Cloud Factory because I needed that input at that point. You need to know what your capabilities are internally, and then work out where you need to buy or borrow that capability in externally, and so have that really clear up front, because what you don't want to do is start to make decisions and then find that actually they may need to revert. To Ben's point earlier on and Arvind's point, there are different models, and you start going too far down the route. You should have really had that conversation up front. Sorry, that wasn't very quick, Chris, but I think it's a valid point to make.
No, perfect, Jenny. Thank you. Ben, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I think tax, and if organisations have some form of global mobility function or people that are responsible for global mobility, because those teams, they hold a lot of knowledge, right? Because what you don't want to do is set up in a country which is incredibly difficult to get into, be it from an immigration perspective, tax treaty network, because you're going to want people to go in and people to come out. And if that's difficult, time zones, it's costly, it's not going to work. So I think tax and global mobility, they have a lot of good knowledge and specialist knowledge that they can bring to the table on this.
Arvind, is there anything you want to add briefly before we?
No, I think the tax point that Ben made and you reiterated is absolutely important. It has to be dealt with right up front. And the one function that's missing in that list from Amy is finance. According to me, it has to be there as well, obviously. And then to Jenny's point, really take it wider. I know confidentiality and employees, getting nervous about it, all of those things have to be managed, but at the leadership level, senior leadership level, take it wider, and then you can narrow it down if necessary, would be my call. So, when I have done workshops and advisory sessions on this, my call has been bring them all in. Let's have the conversation, and then we can single out those people who need to remain in the room for the longer term, and the others who can leave, essentially. So that's how it goes for me.
Thank you, Arvind. That's great. Thank you all. That's been wonderful.